Hi everyone. Welcome to Music 103, online for the fall of 2020. This is our first lecture video, and I'm excited to get started right away by jumping in to talk about some important foundational ideas in music. So we're going to start with a couple of questions. So this is a class about musical rudiments. In other words, basic concepts of music that we use to build together to talk about more complex ideas in music. So let's start by asking ourselves, what are the rudiments of music? What are the features of sound that are vitally important so that we want to be able to describe them accurately when we talk about music? Second of all, a related question, once we decide what the fundamental features of music are, how do we write down information about those features? And related to that question, why do we write down things about music? Why can't we just entirely learn about music by playing it and hearing it and maybe talking about it? Why is it important to be musically literate? Being musically literate, meaning being able to read and write down music, is not the same as having musical ability. Many people in the world are highly competent musicians without being able to read and write music. So why take the time and trouble to learn to read and write music, which is the first thing we're going to do this semester? Well, mostly because it's a convenient and well-established way of conveying musical information. It's a very handy thing to be able to talk about music in theoretical terms. So that said, there's lots of ways to convey information about music and lots of systems for doing it, and each system emphasizes different things about music. So we're going to start by talking about musical pitch and how pitch is notated. So pitch is the high and low of sound. And the term pitch is roughly synonymous with the term frequency. Pitch is probably the most emphasized element of music in traditional music theory. And there's lots of ways of talking about it. Let's say that we hear this pitch. There are several different ways that we could write down this pitch or talk about it. So let's start with maybe the most precise and scientific way of talking about it. Let's talk about it in hertz or cycles per second. Here's a simple online tone generator that I found. When you click on play, it plays a single sine wave, which means it is playing one frequency, and that frequency is expressed in hertz down here at the bottom. You can hear the pitch goes down as we go lower in hertz and goes up when we go higher. And when we get to exactly 440 hertz, like that, it's playing roughly the same note as what I was playing on my piano. The tone generator also lets us explore a couple interesting things about frequency and hearing. So for one thing, when we lower the frequency enough, we eventually get to a frequency too low for us to hear. Somewhere around 20 hertz, or maybe a little lower. Going the other direction, as we increase the frequency, we do get to a point around 1000 hertz where the tone seems much louder. This may in fact be a little uncomfortable, so be warned. That's because human hearing has a very sensitive range between roughly 1000 hertz and 10,000 hertz. And as we go higher and higher, we'll eventually get to a point where we'll go out of the upper range of human hearing. So my hearing cuts out at around 15,000 hertz. Yours maybe goes a little bit higher. Younger people with better ears can hear upwards of 20,000 hertz. In a lot of circumstances, describing a pitch in hertz is probably not terribly useful. Say that you're a singer in a choir and someone asks you to sing 440 hertz. It would be pretty hard to sing that exactly. And what if you accidentally sing 438 hertz or 442 hertz? Would a listener really hear that as a different note? Probably not. So in lots of ways, it's more useful to refer to pitches by the musical alphabet. Many of you are no doubt already familiar with the musical alphabet. It's a system where pitches are assigned letter names using the first 7 letters of the alphabet. We can find these letter names on the white keys of a piano keyboard. If you look at a piano keyboard, you'll notice that it's not just alternating white, black, white, black, white, black the whole way. There's definitely a pattern to the keys that helps you find your way around. So anytime I've got 2 black keys, and I go to the white note that's immediately to the left of the leftmost black key, We're going to call this by the letter name of C. And we're going to write out our collection of alphabet names. C, D, E, F, G, A. At this point we wrap back around, and B. With my high-tech dry erase marker, I've labeled my piano now. I've always wondered why the scale of all white keys starts on C and not A, because it seems like A ought to be like the basic thing that you start a scale of all white keys with, and I've never come up with a satisfactory answer to this question. Something to do with tradition and solfege and the Guidonian hand, and you hopefully will have a good explanation someday. Something you might not know, even if you're familiar with the musical alphabet already, is that in some countries, like Germany, this letter B would actually not be here. You would call this note H. And if you said B, you would actually refer to this black key right below H, resetting this to B. So what happens after we reach B? At this point, we've run out of letters in our musical alphabet. And also, you might notice the pattern of black and white keys on the keyboard has reset. So that means we are at a point where we would call the octave above our starting C. And the next note we would come to would be, once again, C. So that brings up the question, what is an octave? Let's go back to our tone generator for just a second. There's actually a little drop down that tells you the letter name of the pitch that we're hearing, or at least the closest letter name. So if we reset this back to 440 hertz, you notice that down here in the drop down, it's telling us that this is the pitch also called A4. So if this is an A, where's the next A up? Where's the octave A? Let's find out. We went past it a little bit. Oh, hey, look at that. It turns out, if we slide up to find it, we hit it at exactly 880 hertz, which is twice the frequency of the lower A. If we go back to 440 hertz, and we want to find out how far we have to go down to get to the A below, looks like it's going to be, as you might predict, 220 hertz. So how can I indicate which A I mean in any stretch of the piano without referring to it as like A440 or A220 or whatever? We can do this by assigning all the notes an octave number as well as a letter name. So the octave number tells you which octave above the bottom of the piano you are in. And the octave numbers roll over every time you come to a new C. So let's say that we are in this octave of the piano, C3. So we would count from the bottom. Here's the lowest C on the piano, which you can't see, but it's down there. Here's the next lowest, C2. And here's C3. So we could label these guys real fast. That would mean the very next thing to come along would be C4, also known as middle C. I bet a lot of us are already familiar with middle C. But that's how octave numbers work. We number from the bottom of the piano. If you're not familiar with pianos, what you might not realize is that the piano goes down below this C, all this way to A0. And there are actually special pianos called Bosendorfer pianos that have like 3 extra keys under this little like hidey like cabinet thing in the bottom that you can play. Those are kind of cool. So let's return to this note one last time. We know that we could call it A4 because it's the A above the 4th octave C or middle C. And we could also call it A440, assuming that my piano is tuned precisely. And to be honest, I haven't checked. But what if we're talking to a computer? I could ask a computer to create this pitch by specifying 440 hertz. Here's a tiny bit of code in a program called Super Collider, and I'm going to ask it to play a sine tone at a frequency of 440. Yep, it's that same pitch that we've been hearing this whole time. So I can ask it to do something very similar by telling it to play a pitch with the MIDI number 69. Once again, I found another way to identify this particular pitch. The way MIDI numbers work is that they are numbering from C0, which is a note that would be way below the range of the piano. It would actually be 12 hertz in frequency below the range of human hearing. So I can call this note MIDI number 69 because it's the 69th note above this very, very low C that isn't even on my piano. Or I can call it A440 because that's its frequency. Or I can call it A4, which is its alphabet name and octave name. So here are 3 useful terms to know. First, octave, which we can think of in 2 different ways. We can think of it as the distance or interval between 2 consecutive notes with the same letter name. So from F to F, B to B, these are all octaves. We can also think of it in a scientific kind of way as doubling a frequency. That's what happens every time we go up any octave on the piano. And related to that is the idea of octave equivalence. The idea that 2 notes an octave apart are functionally the same in some way. They do the same job in the same scale or chord, for example. And it's assumed that scales start over at the octave. There are some scales that don't start over at the octave. One that I know about is called the Bolin-Pierce scale, and it's like this big interval, which is bigger than an octave, divided up into 13 equal divisions. One last useful term to know is division of the octave, which just means how many smaller intervals the octave is divided into. These can be equal or not. If we look at the piano keyboard one more time, we see that between like these 2 notes an octave apart, we have a total of 12 notes, right? So this is what's called 12 EDO, and EDO stands for equal division of the octave, because all of these notes are about the same difference in pitch. So that was several different ways to talk about pitch already, and there's one last one on this slide, which is an example of staff notation. Once again, it means the same note, this one right here. And that's going to be our focus for this week, is learning to read staff notation. Here's a picture of the kind of musical staff you typically find in, say, piano music. So this is what's called a grand staff. And that means it's actually made of 2 staves, one on top and one on bottom, and they're joined by this bracket thing here on the left. The first symbol that appears on a staff is always the clef. And clef is the French word for key. You can think of it as the clef is the key to unlocking the code of the lines and spaces of each staff. Here we have 2 clefs, one for each staff, one on top and one on bottom. The one on top is called the treble clef, and the one on bottom is called the bass clef. These 2 clefs are the most commonly used clefs in staff notation. Other things appearing on our staff include the key signature, which gives you information about what pitches you should use to make the scale of the key that you're in. Notice that the key signature is different. It's on different lines and spaces for the treble clef than it is for the bass clef. To the right of the key signature is the time signature. The time signature gives you information about the meter and the rhythmic values that you're going to use to make the music. Finally, the last thing we see is a bar line, which marks the end of a measure. And a measure is usually 1 metric cycle. So when we see a clef, we know that what it's doing is telling us that the lines of that staff have specific letter names. So treble clef and bass clef, they both have landmark notes, meaning they point to one particular note and we associate them with that note. So if you look at treble clef, it looks like a fancy letter G, and it is derived from the letter G. And its inner circly part is circling the second line from the bottom of the staff. So that line is always G, and it's always specifically this G right here. G4, meaning the G right above middle C, or you could think of it as the G that's 4 G's from the bottom of the piano. We can figure out the names of the rest of the lines. So the bottom line must be E, then comes G. Above that, the middle line must be B. The second line from the top must be D, and the top line is F. In between those, we find F, A, C, and E. Lots of people learn a mnemonic device to remember the names of the lines of the different staffs. For treble clef, a really common one is every good boy does fine. You're going to make up your own original mnemonic device this week as part of your homework. So for example, everyone goes batty during finals. That's a good one. So instruments that use the treble clef would be relatively high-pitched instruments. So for example, the flute, or the glockenspiel, or high-voiced singers like sopranos and tenors. So bass clef works in a similar way. It also has a landmark note. As you notice, it kind of looks like a fancy F, and it has these 2 dots on either side of the second line from the top of your staff. That's this note. And it's always the F right below middle C, also known as F3, or the third F from the bottom of the piano. We can figure out the rest of the bass clef lines. So if this one is F, then the one above it must be A. The one below it must be D. The one below that must be B. And the lowest line of the bass clef staff must be G. In between them, the spaces must be A, C, E, and G. Remember the mnemonic device, good boys do fine always, which goes along with every good boy does fine. You can remember the device for the spaces, all cars eat gas, or all cows eat grass, or in a greener world, all cars eat grass. Or you can make up your own mnemonic device like, great big dogs fart agitatedly, which is very true. Instruments that use bass clef are going to be low-pitched instruments like cello, or trombone. So once again, here's where the landmark notes for treble and bass clef are on the piano. This one for treble, the G4. This one for bass clef, the F3. And I know what you're thinking. Wouldn't it be convenient if we used middle C as a landmark for a clef? I mean, it's very weird because middle C, even though it's important, is sort of left hanging by itself in a special no man's land between the two staffs. Here it is hanging out below the treble clef staff, and here's middle C hanging out above the bass clef staff. Both times it's on what's called a ledger line, which is those little lines that extend the staff when we need them to go a little bit higher or a little bit lower. Well, it turns out there are clefs for which middle C is the landmark note. They both use the same notchy symbol, which is called C clef, and they're called tenor and alto clef. And instruments that use them tend to be kind of middle range instruments. So bassoon and trombone sometimes use tenor clef, and the instrument that uses alto clef most often is the viola. So now we know how to figure out the letter name of a pitch written on a staff. And that covers the white keys of the piano, but what about these black keys back here? How do we label them? To indicate these pitches, the black key pitches, we use accidentals. I don't know why they're called accidentals. We're definitely doing it on purpose. Accidentals are symbols that tell us to go either up a half step, which would be a sharp, or down a half step, which would be a flat. This raises the question, what is a half step? So a half step is the smallest distance on the piano, like between two notes that are right next to each other. So for example, between this black key and this white key right next to it is a half step. Something that's important to notice is that there are places on the piano keyboard where there are two white keys right next to each other that are a half step apart. However, most of the white keys next to each other are a whole step apart, meaning there's a black key in between them, creating two half steps. It's possible to give every black key two different names. So, for example, if I'm coming up from C, I would probably call this C sharp. If I'm coming down from D, I would call it D flat, but it's the same pitch. So that means that these are enharmonic names for the same pitch. There are probably scales out there where C sharp and D flat are just a little bit different, so they wouldn't be exactly enharmonic. But the 12 equal division of the octave system that the piano uses is designed so that the black keys are enharmonic, whether we call them sharp or flat. One more accidental that we should know about is the natural, which cancels a sharp or flat sign. So this week, in your homework and in our subsection meetings, you're going to spend some time practicing your staff reading skills and also locating pitches on the piano keyboard. Now, you might already be good at that kind of thing, but there's no guarantee that all of your classmates will be. So be patient if this seems like basic stuff. And if you're looking for something interesting to do, you might try messing around with this online microtonal synthesizer that I found. So you can go in here and change the tuning. You can add like way more divisions of the octave if you want. That's what I've done. And you can make your own synth sounds. And it's... So at the beginning of this video, I said that staff notation was a convenient and well-established way to share musical ideas. And that's true, but there's also lots of other ways to visually convey information about music. We're going to take a quick look at some of these. So let's start with guitar tablature. If you're a guitarist, you're probably familiar with this already. A tablature is any kind of symbolic system that indicates physical positions or actions that you do in order to get the sounds that you want. It's not the same as notation of the sounds themselves, because nothing that we see on this tablature really represents the sound itself. So, for instance, this guitar tab here tells us which guitar strings to press and at what fret to press them in order to play the guitar solo from Carry On My Wayward Son. You might notice that the tablature doesn't tell you much about the rhythm. It kind of assumes that you know the melody and know how to put it together as the performer. I don't personally read guitar tabs all that well, but I can play piano from chord symbols. So chord symbols are another kind of system that's an alternative to fully notated music. Lots of pop music and lots of jazz charts use chord symbols. What they do is they give you information about how to build a chord above a certain pitch. It doesn't tell me whether I should be playing this on piano or guitar, and it doesn't tell me what rhythm to play these chords in. One thing you come across is a fully notated lead melody combined with chords to create a lead sheet. So this little snippet here is a bit of a lead sheet to Miles Davis's tune-up. The melody goes... with the chords... So there are also pieces of music that use graphic scores in which the composer has largely invented their own notation system. Some graphic scores might be very precise in how you're supposed to interpret them, and others might be left open to the performer to figure out what things mean and how they should be realized in sound. And there's also music visualizers out there, which is kind of the reverse of a graphic score. A music visualizer might represent pitch or rhythm or any number of other things about the music, and some of them seem to correspond more directly to the sounds than others. One last fun thing I found on the internet is Black MIDI, which is a visualization of MIDI information that's composed to be interpreted by a computer with an overwhelming amount of sonic and visual information. So many MIDI blips on the screen that it turns black is the idea. So this was just kind of showing different fun ways that pitch could be represented visually. So I hope that the intro to staff notation in this video was clear. Like I said, a lot of your homework is going to be just sort of a boot camp of reading staff notation. Please look for the quiz about this video on Moodle soon. And be thinking of questions that you would like to ask me when we do our first subsections this week, which I think will be a lot of fun. And thanks everyone for being part of Music 103 this semester, and I will see you soon.